say sometimes that timing is everything. Timing is everything. So when is the right time to ask the faithfulness question? When is the right time to pose a question about faithfulness? The question of whether you have been faithful or I have been faithful. When is it time to pose the question about faithfulness? And it doesn't matter what we're talking about here, any kind of a setting where faithfulness is an issue, faithfulness in relation to one's vocation, faithfulness in relation to one's commitments and one's promises, faithfulness in terms of one's relationships to spouse or family or employer, or faithfulness to God. Whatever setting you want to put the question into, when is it time to talk about faithfulness? I can tell you one time when it is not very helpful, not very useful to talk about faithfulness. There's no point really in posing the faithfulness question at the end. At the end, after it's too late to change, after there is no room left for renegotiation, after there is no life left in the relationship or in the situation, after there's no life left, there's no point in talking about faithfulness because you can't do anything about it. It's all over with. In the funeral liturgy of the church, this is one of the places where the question of faithfulness can sometimes come up in a funeral setting. In the funeral liturgy of the church, something interesting happens in relation to this question. The liturgy is a tradition that has been handed to us generation after generation after generation. It's modified, it gets stretched and compressed and changed a little bit, but by and large it's a tradition that has been shaped by many generations, and the wisdom that comes from generation after generation has been built into the liturgy so that it says something quite important. Listen to the prayer that comes near the end of the funeral service. Listen to the tone of that prayer. How do these words sound? What kind of a tone do these words set up? What sorts of questions are these words setting up for us? This prayer, into your hands, most merciful Savior, we commend your servant Jane or Mary or whoever, Joe, whoever it is. Acknowledge, we commend your servant. Acknowledge, we humbly beseech you, a sheep of your own fold, a lamb of your own flock, a sinner of your own redeeming. Receive our loved one into the arms of your mercy. The prayer assumes faithfulness, all right, but it assumes that God will be faithful. But after God has been faithful, it doesn't assume much about faithfulness from us. Rather, it assumes that God will be merciful, that God will be gracious. The language is all inviting God's mercy and God's grace, because when we get to the end of the run, and you know how this is, we're never quite faithful enough. We're never quite faithful enough, and so we need, at the end of the run, to offer the person who has died to God's grace and God's mercy, and let God do the embracing, because God is gracious and God is merciful. So at the end is not really the time to ask the question about faithfulness. When is the time? When is the time to ask that question? When is it helpful? When is it productive? When might we gain some benefit from posing the question of faithfulness? Well, the prophet Ezekiel, whose words we heard just a bit ago, he might have something to say about that. Now, we have leapfrogged about 1,000 years. Last Sunday we were in the book of Exodus as God was preparing to lead the people out of slavery in Egypt. We've leapfrogged 1,000 years, and the process is going the other way now. God is in the process of leading the people into captivity in Babylon as punishment for their idolatry. And so the process is going the other way now. Ezekiel is one of the prophets who is responsible for guiding that journey. Stands at a critical place in this letter this prophecy that we read. Chapter 33 is kind of like a crease in the page. And there's all of this stuff on this side of the page, and then comes the crease, and then there's a bunch of stuff on the other side of the crease. Up until now in the book of Ezekiel, there's been a lot of prophecy about destruction and damnation. All sorts of doom is taking shape for all of the nations of the world and for Israel. All kinds of nastiness being set up. And then you come to this part that we read in chapter 33, which is sort of a crease, and on the other side of this reading is now words of consolation, words of hope, words that suggest that some kind of restoration is possible, perhaps. And in the reading that we heard for today, from the beginning of chapter 33, God says to Ezekiel, I have something to say to you, Ezekiel. You are a watchman. You are a sentinel. Anybody here ever worked as a night watchman? I did for a while in the factory when I was in seminary. And your job is to watch, to walk around the factory and make sure there isn't any vandalism going on, or nobody's breaking in, or nothing has caught fire, or whatever. You're walking around the factory. Now, I was unarmed. I didn't even carry a nightstick, so I wasn't going to do anything if I found somebody in the factory, except cry for help or call the police or whatever. But I understand this being a watchman kind of a thing. You are a sentinel, God says to Ezekiel. Your job is to watch, yes. To watch what's going on, watch what's happening. But what else? If you have simply watched, have you done your job? God said to Ezekiel, there's more to it. As you watch this destruction unfold, help the people understand what's going on. Help them learn whatever lessons need to be learned from it. Help the people change. Help the people change their lives. Because you remember, he is speaking sort of in this midpoint between the two pieces of the prophecy. And in this midpoint, life can still be saved. Yes, things are nasty. Yes, things are dangerous. Yes, the situation is almost deadly. But change is still possible. It is possible, and in fact you heard the words of the prophet, turn back from your evil ways, turn back to the ways of life, turn back so that you may live. And by the way, Ezekiel, there's a word in here for you too. There's a word for you. If you do what I tell you to do, if you do your job, if you warn the people, then the responsibility for their response is their problem. But if you do not do your job, then their blood I will require at your hands. And so the words ring out like an alarm clock. They ring out like an alarm clock in Ezekiel's own soul. And he knows what he needs to do. And what he speaks, he hopes, will ring out like an alarm clock in the ears of the people who will hear him. Wake up! Wake up, Ezekiel! Wake up, people! Wake up, because now is the time. Now is the time to get it right. Which is what St. Paul was talking about in that reading from Romans. He tells us what the rule is, a rule that Jesus himself had affirmed, a rule that says that we are not to owe anyone anything except to love one another. And then he goes on to do what Jesus had done with that same rule, to say that all of the other commandments, if you properly understand love, you understand how to keep all of the other commandments. And if you properly love the various people in your lives, you will automatically keep the commandments. If you love your spouse, you will not commit adultery. If you love your neighbor, you won't try to steal his stuff. All of these things, if you properly love the people who are around you, you will know how to behave toward them. You will know what is right, and you will know to do what is right. And so St. Paul fleshes this whole rule out in the way that we expect it to be fleshed out. All the commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not covet, and all the rest, he said, are summed up in one word. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And then you would expect a period. You would expect that to be the end of the sermon, except that isn't where Paul ends. Remember what he said next? You know what time it is. Now is the time to wake up. Now is the moment to wake up. This is alarm clock time. Now is the time to start doing what the rule tells you to do. Now is the time. Now is the time. So now is the time to pose the faithfulness question. Now is the time to come to terms with the expectations that go with faithfulness. Are we living our calling faithfully? Are we heeding the call to turn back to the ways of life? Are we calling the people for whom we have responsibility, our children, our grandchildren, our family members, our friends, the people that we have influence over, are we calling them back to the ways of life? How faithful are we keeping the one commandment that really matters, the commandment that fulfills all of the others, the commandment to love one another? Because you see, now is the time to wake up. Now is the time to check up. Now is the time to shape up. Now is the time to be faithful.